Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. So, my guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Ted Olson, and if you are a long-time listener to this podcast, you'd have heard Ted when we talked about Doc Watson's 100th birthday earlier in the year. Ted also wrote the liner notes for the fantastic Doc Watson box set that came out recently, and the liner notes, the essay that came with Nothing But Green Willow, which we talked about on the podcast a couple of months ago as well. So Ted has been featured on this many times already. Ted, it's great to have you back.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Matt. It's always good to hear what you have to say about music, and I learn something every time I hear your podcast. So thank you.
Oh, well, that's very kind. It's a joy doing them. And we've got a really interesting topic today. We've got a topic that I think is something people will be familiar with, but is actually a jumping off point to explore something much wider. And that is sort of the Bristol Sessions, but not just the Bristol Sessions on their own. The Bristol Sessions as part of a much wider context of recording that was going on in the Appalachian region around that time. And I think maybe the interesting point to start at is that lots of people will have heard the Bristol Sessions described as the big bang of country music, and this idea that sort of country music as we know it originated at the Bristol Sessions. And one of the things, what sort of kicked off this conversation we're having today was 3 Bear Family box sets, but also a single CD highlights from each, which look at the Bristol Sessions, but also the Johnson City Sessions and the Knoxville Sessions, and this idea that people were recording commercial music in Appalachia around 100 years ago, and it was part of a much bigger thing that was going on, not just one particular set of sessions.
Yes. You mentioned the adage or the, I sometimes refer to it as jargon, the big bang of country music. I've learned to have my quarrels with that particular slogan in the last 25 years as I pursued research of the Bristol Sessions. Frankly, country music was launched as a commercial music form in 1923, and it took off very quickly, and there were million-selling records by 1924. So even as I've explored the history of the Bristol Sessions, I've quarreled with that notion, and it's an interesting kind of paradox, I guess, is that I believe so strongly in those records and those artists, but I challenge the notion of their supremacy in our musical evolution. It's often said, a friend of mine who contributed an essay to a book I wrote on the Bristol Sessions said it would make many of the artists who recorded in Bristol in 1927 and 1928, it would make them wince to think in terms of evolutionary theory and what they were doing. They were recording their home music in a studio, makeshift studio in Bristol, Tennessee. And it had nothing to do with big bangs or birthplaces. It had to do with a heartfelt sharing of their community music and their own music. And in some cases, it was handmade music. And I feel as if it's almost dishonoring the Bristol Sessions heritage to confuse the issue. So moving forward, I mean, I've been studying this for 25 years alongside Charles Wolfe and then Tony Russell, is that I feel as if getting beyond the slogans or the jargon to the heart of the matter is that great music was recorded in Bristol in 1927 and 1928, even revolutionary music. But revolutionary music, great music, had been recorded from 1923 forward. And, I'm honestly working on projects as we speak to try to bring those older stories, the pre-1927 stories, to the public's attention. So probably it's important to talk about that up front so that, people aren't considering everything that happened after Bristol as somehow a letdown, because I don't view it that way at all. I'm as big a fan of the Johnson City Sessions and the Knoxville Sessions as I am of the Bristol Sessions. And honestly, I think they were equally influential, just in different ways.
Yeah, and I think some of it is that we tend to like some sort of creationist myth when it comes to art. Like, you know, we like the idea that Bill Monroe was single-handedly responsible for bluegrass, and we like the idea that, you know, there's a one genius behind things. And as always, it's a visionary person at the right time, surrounded by other people. And, you know, and that was, I think that was a really interesting thing coming into this conversation about all these sessions for me, because I'd heard the Bristol Sessions recordings before, some of them, and like listening back to, you know, tracks that were recorded nearly 100 years ago, I sort of saw them almost as museum pieces and like an interesting curiosity. And going back through this, I haven't had the full box sets, but I've listened to the single CD sort of distillations of each of those sessions and read the essays and read the liner notes and sort of getting into the context of it all. So it's not just one set of Bristol Sessions, but all these other recordings and what was going on in the world at that point. And it just brings it to life so much. And I found myself like just transported back, and I don't feel like I'm listening to history. I just feel like I'm listening to music, and all the accompanying stuff is so fascinating, and it's something that you miss when you just stream something.
Well, Bear Family Records, of course, deserves a lot of the credit for the marvelous masters that are included in these projects, because they sought out this great mastering engineer, this sound engineer, Marcus Heumann, and he's the one responsible for the terrific sound on the Bristol Sessions single CD release and also the Knoxville Sessions single CD release. Before that, it was Christian Svarg, and he's also an acclaimed sound engineer in Germany. So Bear Family Records identified these mastering engineers, put them to work, put them to the task of seeking out, well, we helped with the process of seeking out the records, but then the mastering engineer took over, made digital streams or digital versions of old, dusty, sometimes extremely well-loved 78 RPM discs, and converted them to the glorious sound that we hear today that I agree with you, Matt. Those recordings sound like they could have been recorded yesterday. They don't seem historical. They don't seem dusty or antiquated. And that is definitely a credit to the science of sound engineering. But let's also say, and to be honest, some of the artists who recorded in, say, Bristol or Johnson City or Knoxville were ahead of their time. And stylistically, they've founded sounds that artists subsequently learned from and in some cases copied. I'm referring, of course, to the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers and Clarence Ashley on the Johnson City Sessions and Howard Armstrong in the Knoxville Sessions. These are some of the greatest Appalachian artists of the last 100 years, certainly. And so, you know, their music, their records sound pristine because of the sound engineering, but the performances sound like they could be heard today anywhere across the world where roots music from the United States is beloved. We could hear those types of performances, those stylistic interpretations of old songs, simply because of the long shadows cast by people such as Jimmy Rogers, the Carter family, Clarence Ashley, or Howard Armstrong, or many others. And yeah, so it's very much the case for me too, is when I hear these single CD releases or the box sets that spawn them, I mean, I'm sitting squarely in the present day, hearing music that seems relevant in the present moment. It doesn't seem like it's some musty, dusty historical document. It very much seems like a living presence. And in all honesty, one of the great pleasures and consequences of all this work over the last quarter of a century in trying to bring these stories to the public is that the communities that originally spawned these recording sessions have also embraced this music and this legacy and these stories as being relevant in the present day. And so that's very gratifying for the scholarly endeavor that was undertaken by a number of us. I mean, have to give credit where credit is due. People like Charles Wolfe and Nolan Porterfield and Tony Russell, and not to leave any names out, but those are three principal titans of scholarship that made my work possible. But everyday folk in Bristol, Johnson City, and Knoxville now know this music, and they have these records in their collections and listen to them on a, if not daily, a weekly basis. And Bear Family Records has not made any of this music available to my awareness through streaming platforms. So they want people to engage with these high quality transfers in kind of pristine form, and the high quality digital CD releases with liner notes and design work and the full kind of curation effect. So that is very much in the planning from Bear Family Records, is to make this music something that we sit down and listen carefully to what's happening in the albums, as opposed to listening to them passively as background music. It's very much meant to be kind of music that is epochal and culture shaping, and yet it also is fun. A lot of the music is delightfully entertaining, and not something that one necessarily has to listen to with the peak of reverence. I mean, sure, we listen to it with great reverence, but we also feet start tapping, and I know a lot of people who dance to this music. I mean, they put on the records and they dance around the house. So it's music that lives and breathes in the 21st century, even if it is very close to being 100 years old from the time it was recorded.
And I think there's one track that the first time I'd heard it, I think it was the Blind Alfred Ree record Virginian, and it's just fiddle and voice, and the sort of the presence of that sound. I wasn't prepared for how, because it's preceded by a kind of group vocal track where there's a lot of people in the room being captured by one microphone, and there's this big sound, and then all of a sudden you've got this very intimate fiddle and vocal, such a breadth of sound, and such a sort of, it's like you're sitting in a room with somebody playing you a song. And it's astonishing. And I guess part of that goes, we're lucky that these sessions were recorded with, I guess what was a pretty new electrical microphone at that point, rather than the traditional acoustic horn. So they were able to capture a much bigger breadth of stuff. And so it has translated. We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam-Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings Guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com.
That's exactly right. That's one of the reasons why the Bristol Sessions recordings and then the Johnson City Sessions, 1 year later, Knoxville Sessions 2 years later, late 1920s into 1930, why this East Tennessee recorded music sounds so fresh is because it was recorded electronically. The microphone system was new starting in about 1926. And so it was introduced right at the vanguard of these recording sessions. Recordings made in 1925 and 24 and 23, while they were pioneering and capturing brilliant performances by people, that we could mention names. Ernest Stoneman is one example of an earlier artist who also recorded at the Bristol Sessions, but he was already a star from 1924 forward. Henry Witter was another country music star before he recorded in Bristol. And people such as Vernon Dalhart, who's somewhat overlooked or neglected today, but he was a best-selling country artist from 24 onward. Some of their records from that period, 24, 25, 26, sound muffled today because of the acoustic recording process. Now, the good news about that is sound engineering in the modern sense can restore some of that sound and make kind of improve upon some of those that dynamically kind of lower quality sound that is associated with the acoustic recording process. But we can't cast out those earlier records just because the technology didn't allow them to, shine at their optimal dynamic range, because after all, the performances are brilliant. So, but yes, the electronic microphone that had been introduced in the mid-1920s did make possible a much more accurate sound capture. And somebody like a blind Alfred Reed, who was used to performing on the street, he was blind and he played on the streets of southern West Virginia. He was very used to that intimate exchange of music for people's attention on the street, for coins that they would give him, that he would support his family as a street musician, among other things. He was a very talented, multifaceted individual, but he was a great composer. And he brought his wares, he brought his music to the streets there in Princeton, West Virginia, and other places nearby. And, that intimacy that he was used to performing on the street corners, he brought into the studio. And it's certainly powerful performances by blind Alfred Reed for sure on the Bristol Sessions. And then, of course, blind Alfred Reed continued to record after Bristol into the late 20s and made some extremely beloved, influential sides for 78s as late as 1929. His best-known side was How Can a Poor Man Stand Such Times and Live?, which, of course, has been covered by Ry Cooder and Bruce Springsteen and many others. And he was, in essence, a discovery, as it were, although that word's problematical because he knew who he was. He just happened to be driven down to Bristol to make records there right there for Ralph Peer in July of 1927. And so Bristol was a great kind of coincidental meeting of the minds. I mean, it wasn't necessarily set up to happen as magically as it did. It was a situation where a lot of luck intervened, and Jimmy Rogers showed up, and the Carters showed up, and blind Alfred Reed showed up, and most of these artists were not in advance kind of booked for sessions. They just kind of developed. Ernest Stoneman was planned to perform at the Bristol Sessions, but most everything else was kind of happenstance and serendipity, and that is true magic. So Bristol should definitely be honored for the magic that happened there. But of course, magic had been happening in studios, across the Eastern Seaboard from the mid-20s onward. I mean, artists were going to New York City to make records. They were going to Camden, New Jersey to make records, and other cities as well. And Atlanta, for sure, was another recording center in the mid-1920s. And, magic was happening in those studios as well. So the difference about what happened in Bristol, and frankly, 2 years earlier, we should acknowledge Ralph Peer, the producer who made the Bristol Sessions, was in fact in Asheville, North Carolina, and he was making records in Asheville. So those are really the first Appalachian recording sessions. And, the incredible recordings were being made. Sadly, the Asheville Sessions of 1925 were made acoustically. So they just don't have the immediacy of what happened 2 years later. But there were sessions before Bristol, and there were sessions after, and they were all important, and they're all part of the story. And I'm currently interested in telling those other stories beyond the three major location recording sessions that have already found their way into Bear family projects. And so there are, maybe 5 or so other location recording sessions in Appalachia that I'm kind of pursuing to tell those stories as well in the current moment. I'm kind of making every effort to try to create projects which release those records and tell those stories through the notes.
And there's I think what's one of the really interesting things that runs through all of this is a phrase you used earlier, actually. You called them commercial recordings, because there's a very big difference between these and kind of field recordings that were meant to document, people traveling around Appalachia, either writing songs down or recording them with early recording equipment. These were temporary but intentionally set up recording studios intended to capture music to be sold, weren't they?
Absolutely. Yes, the Bristol Sessions, the Johnson City Sessions, the Knoxville Sessions, the Asheville Sessions, the Winston-Salem Sessions, the Ashland, Kentucky Sessions, Norton, Virginia Sessions. These are some of the Appalachian location recording sessions of the late 1920s. And there are, frankly, others. They were, the ones I'm referring to, were all conducted by grizzled veterans of the commercial recording industry of that era. And they were all about finding sounds that could be cut and distributed on commercial discs, on playback at 78 RPM, and that people would be enticed to purchase for play on their own home Victrola machines. And a lot of money was changing hands in the process of enjoying this music. I should point out that money was not necessarily changing hands in the direction of the creators of the music. The artists who recorded weren't always netting much, if anything, in terms of reimbursement or salary for their sharing their talents. I mean, I hear stories of some of the artists never even received a copy of the released 78 platter that was commercially available. They were never given the courtesy of being sent a copy. So some of the artists, say at Knoxville, they grew older and only later did somebody hold a copy of their record and show it to them decades later. And they were surprised. They didn't realize that exactly the nature of what was happening. But I think everybody did know that records were booming by, the mid-20s. 78s were all the rage by that time. And that's why releases by Vernon Dalhart and Ernest Stoneman were selling, close to 1 million copies in 24, 25, because of the power of the human voice in a permanent form that was ready to the command of the person seeking to be moved and entertained by that music. And it was the opposite, frankly, of documentary field recording, which is, of course, that other style of recording where people, might think of the Lomaxes, John and Alan, traveling through the country, traveling through the Southeast and beyond. Frankly, Alan went all over the world making documentary recordings of people making music within a cultural context. And Alan or other field recording documentarians were much less concerned about getting something into any kind of form that would be commercially palatable to a mass market. They were much more interested in recording what spontaneously would be created within a cultural environment. That's maybe a bit of a generalization, but because somebody like an Alan Lomax was also interested in the commercial market in a way and converted field recordings into commercial songs. Think in terms of some of Leadbelly's recordings became hits later on. And sometimes they were credited to Alan Lomax, which is unbelievable in retrospect that the documentarian would get that degree of credit for it, but that had to do with copyright and how loosely defined ownership was among people in that era. And then, of course, think in terms of Tom Dooley. There's another example of a field recording that was made in the 30s by Frank and Ann Warner, who were documentarians, Alan Lomax then published an arranged version and then was credited with kind of controlling the copyright of that song for some years after that. And of course, it became a smash hit in the top 40. I mean, it was a number one hit in the 50s in the American pop charts. So that's that whole other world, but there's obviously crossover because, documentarians are not necessarily completely oblivious to the kind of the cultural, the value of what they were collecting. And it's one of the great controversies of that era in terms of who owned the rights to the music. And frankly, the commercial music, the location recording sessions that happened in Bristol, Johnson City, Knoxville, and these other places we had mentioned earlier, even though these were overtly commercial sessions, there still was this same theme of who owned the music. There was the same struggle for control of that music. And one of the reasons why Ralph Peer, the mastermind of the Bristol Sessions, became one of the wealthiest Americans in the entertainment industry, it's because he masterminded a kind of a music industry management plan, which sought to manage artists and to share, create a sharing arrangement with the copyrighted material for commercial distribution. So he benefited greatly by his associations with Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family. And, here where I live in East Tennessee, I'm friendly with some of the present day Carters, and they, I wouldn't say they're bitter, but they're pretty clear about the fact is that they made historically impactful music that the Carter family did, 90 years ago and such. The original Carter family trio and then descendants kind of kept the music alive. But it wasn't necessarily profitable to the family the way the copyright arrangement worked and the management arrangement worked. A lot of detail there that we probably can't go into because it's complex. But just as a general rule, location recording sessions were concerned about commercial palatability of recordings and technology. There was an awareness that technology had advanced to such a degree with the electronic miking system and the portability of recording systems to rural locations or to small cities near rural locations. It made possible records that would not have been made earlier, 3 or 4 years earlier, when a lot of musicians couldn't have made the trip to New York or Camden, New Jersey, or even Atlanta. Travel may have been an issue before. That was the genius of the location recording plan, is to bring the recording equipment close to people where they lived. And I think that's a degree to which how visceral the music sounds. It sounds like people making music in their home community, not, kind of detached from it. So, I'll definitely say that the location recording philosophy was brilliant from, shall we say, an aesthetic perspective, because it did make possible commercial recording of some vital music that was always produced with an eye for commercial sale, but nonetheless had a lot of energy and a lot of kind of, shall we say, authenticity to it, because it was coming from people who made that music every day of their lives. It was community music that was subsequently shared with the world through the medium of recorded sound.
I think that's a really interesting point. And the sense that I got from reading the liner notes to these 3 CDs was that of the 3 sessions, Bristol was perhaps the one where least was planned in advance in terms of who was going to show up. And it sounds like with Knoxville and Johnson City, a bit more work had gone in advance in terms of kind of publicizing it and making sure people turned up. But the joy of it is if you'd booked people for any of these sessions and they'd been happening in New York, the choice of people selected would have been very different from if you can turn up, you can come and play for us. And so some of the stuff that is on these records is on them because they were recorded in those locations, isn't it?
Absolutely. The Johnson City sessions, for example, you mentioned how they were very well kind of structured in terms of advanced planning and advertisement. And that's absolutely true. A few years back, there was a documentary film series called American Epic. A lot of people have seen that. One of the kind of advertisements that were utilized in newspapers to draw people into Johnson City was a slogan across the ad that was publicized in multiple newspapers around Johnson City and frankly beyond, which said, "Can you sing or play old time music?" A big headline. And it was a big ad. And then below that, it gave the specifics of where you should go if you made this sort of music and if you wanted to share it. And of course, it did specify it was for the purpose of making records. And it kind of intimated that there would be money to be made, although, it was not much, but it was a little. That was the Columbia Records company that did that. The Bristol Sessions were made by Ralph Peer and the Victor Records company. So Columbia and Victor were kind of major rivals at the time. And that explains why Johnson City happened in kind of 1 year after the 27 Bristol Sessions. 27 Bristol Sessions created a notion that major artists are, out there and they can be discovered by companies sending their producers to these locations to make commercial records in makeshift studios. The 27 Bristol Sessions generated great records by, as we said before, the Carter family, Jimmy Rogers, Blind Alfred Reed, and some others, and the folks who ran Columbia Records, specifically Frank Walker, who's another one of the titans of early recorded music. Frank Walker was the person who first recorded Bessie Smith, so he was active in the blues and jazz and Cajun as well as in country. Brought his recording equipment to Johnson City, but was much more situated, I think, to publicize what was going on. It wasn't, kind of more informal, such as the Bristol Sessions started out to be. Bristol Sessions had one little line embedded into a kind of a Victrola furniture company ad that there would be sessions happening in downtown Bristol on such and such a day. It would have been easy to have missed that little one single sentence. The Johnson City ad just leapt off the page of the newspaper, and American Epic showed that image several times within that documentary series about early recording industry. So the Johnson City approach was famously organized and out in front of the arrival of the producer Frank Walker for Columbia Records. And because the ad went out there by means of newspapers and to some degree word of mouth, many people cite the Johnson City Sessions as maybe the best representation of Appalachian old time music of that era, because it was a free for all. Who would show up and what would they bring with them? It wasn't really, there wasn't an advanced sense of what would happen. There was a real sense of discovery there among the music recorded there. I know old time musicians today who know all three of these East Tennessee recording sessions, and a number of folks say that their favorite in terms of the actual records made at the location session, their actual favorite location recording session were the Johnson City Sessions, because they kind of captured that old time energy, that old time sound of that era. Frank Walker, the producer of the Johnson City Sessions, was much less interested in shaping commercial music that could be copyrighted and packaged and managed, such as Ralph Peer had done in Bristol. So, yeah, I guess it's fair to say that Bristol showed the way for future country music as a commercial genre. The Johnson City Sessions was all about capturing kind of the pre-bluegrass community music that was being played by string bands with strong vocals and dynamic family groups and, elements of gospel and blues and certainly, lots of old time music, and a little bit of country influence in the Johnson City Sessions. But it's probably the biggest impact of the Johnson City Sessions would have been on the Harry Smith Anthology of American Folk Music, because some of the major records from Johnson City are on that set, and influenced a whole generation of folk artists such as Bob Dylan, Jerry Garcia, Joan Baez, Judy Collins, and many others. They didn't realize it, but they were big fans of Johnson City Sessions records because they appeared on the Harry Smith Anthology.
Well, that's a really interesting point there, because obviously the Clarence Ashley Cuckoo Bird is from the Johnson City Sessions, and that was one of the anthologized tracks that is, when people think of kind of historic roots music, that's one of the tracks that is at the forefront of conversations. But just putting that CD on and the first track on it, Tell It To Me, I'd never heard before, but I obviously know it as a Doc Watson song, and I know it as an Old Crow Medicine Show song because it's essentially the same as Cocaine Blues, and it's that thread that runs through all of this. And I was going to ask about the folk revival, because I know a lot of these records sold a lot at the time, and the point we're talking about is just as the Depression hit, which presumably would have affected record sales in quite a major way. And I was wondering whether these songs sort of dropped off the radar before the folk revival, or whether they were always there.
The Bristol Sessions of 1927 predated, in terms of their release schedule, predated the Wall Street crash by a year. So that's very fortuitous for the careers of the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers, the timing. Obviously they had great charisma and great talent. And that's what people loved them for. But there was also the element of exposure. People were still buying records in great quantity in 1928, late 1928, when many of the Bristol Sessions recordings from the summer of 1927 were released. And so by that fall of 27, Jimmy Rogers becomes a superstar from the release of T for Texas, Blue Yodel 1. And that was not recorded at Bristol, but it was an invite back by Victor and Ralph Peer, because the actual record made by Jimmy Rogers in Bristol, Two-Sided 78, was not particularly special in some ways, musically speaking, but it did capture a charismatic performer. And so that was all that Ralph Peer needed to know that this person has lots of potential. Let's invite him to up north, and where he cut T for Texas. And of course, that became his breakthrough hit. And some of the songs recorded by the Carters in Bristol did become popular kind of hits. We didn't have the charts in the sense then, but you could tell a hit by something that sold in thousands of copies, and the numbers are copiously recorded in kind of the documentary sheets for some companies. So we actually know how many records were sold of most of the Bristol Sessions and most of the Johnson City Sessions, because major companies kept good records. And it's quite clear that the 28 Johnson City Sessions recordings sold pretty well. In fact, did spawn a couple hits that sold upwards of 70,000 copies. That in the 20s, that would have been a major seller. And sold to people at furniture stores, which was the typical outlet for 78s at the time. But the 28 Bristol Sessions recordings, and particularly the 29 Johnson City Sessions, which was the point at which Clarence Ashley's The Cuckoo Bird and the Bentley Boys' Down on Penny's Farm were recorded in 29 in October of that year, was right at the emergence of, the beginnings of the Great Wall Street. Wall Street had been fluctuating for weeks there, but the great plummet in the end of that month. And one of the very final sessions in Johnson City coincided with Black Thursday, which was part of the great Wall Street crash week there. So there's a story that said that a couple of the artists at the end of the 29 Johnson City Sessions recording period during that 4-day session in October of 29, one of the artists remembered looking over, and the sound engineer for Frank Walker was so distracted by reading the stock market reports that he wasn't kind of focused on the recording process at hand. And it was very upsetting to the artist that the engineer wasn't focused, but it was because of the Wall Street crash happening as they spoke, as they were recording. So the ultimate true fact is that the 29, which are really important recordings that were made in Johnson City, were released in 1930, and it was a depleted market. The recorded sound industry was reeling, and records weren't selling, and so a lot of those great records from Johnson City simply kind of were manufactured in small quantities, didn't sell, and we are, of course, indebted for collectors like Harry Smith and others who had copies in their personal collections and continued to keep those records kind of out there in the public. And of course, the Harry Smith Anthology of American Folk Music did its thing to popularize some of those forgotten records from the in that period of 29 onward into the 30s. But so did somebody such as Doc Watson, because Doc had many of those records in his own family collection and listened to them. I mean, Doc Watson in his personal family collection had records from the Bristol Sessions releases and the Johnson City Sessions release schedule. So he listened to them, learned them, and made them part of his repertoire. So there was a direct connection, of course, between, say, the Bristol Sessions, the Johnson City Sessions, and Doc Watson. A lot of his musical inspiration came by way of those records. And then, of course, have to acknowledge the living, breathing kind of mentorship connection between Clarence Ashley and Doc Watson. They were friendly. They were bandmates. Doc was, in essence, kind of discovered, again, a word that I use cautiously because he knew who he was. He was a master musician long before Ralph Rinsler, saw him there at that Clarence Ashley session that was documented by Folkways Records, the springboard for Doc Watson's, national and internationally renowned career. But it was because of an affiliation with Tom Ashley, Clarence Tom Ashley, that Doc Watson became known by an outside recordman, Ralph Rinsler, who led a management arrangement and then passed the management arrangement on to others, but continued to kind of promote Doc, and Doc's talent took off from there. But direct connection between Bristol, Johnson City, and Doc Watson's music.
It's interesting you talk about the big record labels keeping meticulous records of sales. I was wondering if they also kept pretty detailed records of the sessions, because there's so much detail in these liner notes, not just about the context and the sessions, but like individual performers who, may have turned up that day, recorded and not done much. There's an awful lot of just rich context in there. And I wondered how easy that was to find or how much work it required to unearth all that.
Yeah, a lot of that credit goes to, people such as Charles Wolfe and Tony Russell, who had been researching the story of country music at its earliest stage. They're in the 1920s for decades before this whole box set preparation process took place. Of course, Charles is no longer with us, but I did have the honor to work on a Bristol Sessions book with Charles, and he had copious documentation that he had gathered, and a lot of that came directly from the Victor archives. There was great documentation taken at the time by Ralph Peer or perhaps by his engineer, as far as who showed up, spellings of their names, more or less accurate. All those releases that were not ultimately released to the public. There were recordings of, material that did not find release. That's all documented as well. And then, of course, with Johnson City, many of the artists were quite, the word sounds judgmental. I don't mean it that way, but they were obscure musicians. They had no advanced reputation as artists. Many of those acts that recorded in Johnson City. So we are very much indebted to the fact that Frank Walker and his engineer kept very clear notes about who they were, where they came from. And I will say that in the preparation of the box sets for Bear Family Records, we filled in a lot of gaps in the knowledge of these artists. And that was particularly true with the Knoxville Sessions. Tony Russell and I did a lot of what he often calls old-time archaeology, which is utilizing various kind of research engines to locate, courthouse records and, birth, certificates, death certificates, all kinds of public documents. We were able to tell a full story of virtually all the artists that had recorded at these sessions by a combination of those recording companies having kept pretty good notes, mostly accurate, not always. Sometimes we had to undo inaccurate information. Long stories to that, but many of those stories are told in the liner notes. And then, of course, 21st century, deep dive research that was conducted, possible now because of the internet and access to documents, which, a couple of generations ago would have been required painstaking travel to, county courthouses and such. We have access to that material today. And so there was a great deal of research that was involved from our perspective in the 21st century, but we're also deeply grateful for what was done 100 years ago in terms of documenting those artists. Possibly one thing that needs to be said for people who are unfamiliar with this story of the 1920s era location recording sessions is that all the recordings we have on these box sets were taken directly from existing, as in extant, 78s that still exist in people's collections today in the 21st century. Every last recording on all three of these box sets came from individual collections. There are no master recordings. People are surprised by that. In a few cases, there are test pressings which exist in archives, and we were able to use a few of those on the box set. But by and large, the masters for these 78s were destroyed during the war effort in the 1940s, melted down and reused for military purposes. Frank Walker, the producer of the Johnson City Sessions, was put in charge of utilizing the recording industry to serve the war effort. And so he would have been part of that process of not only allowing it to happen, but probably overseeing that process of recycling some of that material for the war effort. Frank Walker also was in charge. The recorded sound industry, this is getting later in time, around to the time of the emergence of recorded bluegrass in the 40s. But there was a period there in the early 40s during the war when the only recordings that were authorized to be released were to fulfill the patriotic effort. And those recordings, V records, they were often called, those were and overseen, I guess is a good word for it, by Frank Walker, the producer of the Johnson City Sessions. So he'd become like Ralph Peer. Both those gentlemen were major players in the recorded sound period, long past the 20s, but they had already carved out stellar reputations, by the 20s when they came to Bristol or Johnson City, and they're both, I think, equally deserving our respect and our attention. I have felt personally that Walker has been somewhat overlooked or overshadowed by Ralph Peer, and I've done a lot. I'm just speaking here out of a personal commitment and connection to Walker's work as a discoverer of, many blues recording artists. Kind of gave them an opportunity to have their voices be heard. Bessie Smith and many others in the 20s. He was one of the first people to record Cajun music in the late 20s, jazz music in the 30s, people like Len Miller and others, Duke Ellington. And then Frank Walker also was the person who managed, I guess, kind of oversaw, mentored, I guess is the right word, mentored the career of Hank Williams Sr. So famously, Frank Walker called Hank Williams Sr. the hillbilly Shakespeare, which is a term that is affiliated with Hank Williams Sr. to this day. Frank Walker coined that term. So I've been trying to do as much as I could as a scholar and as a fan to try to have people to appreciate Walker's work. So alongside the already well-known and legendary Bristol Sessions, I feel as if the Johnson City Sessions are equally worthy of our attention and equally fine from an aesthetic and historically influential sense of their importance. The Knoxville Sessions are much more obscure and were, in some ways, a much more difficult project for Tony Russell and I to work on because the records were made in 1929 and 1930, so right in the thick of the Depression, when the release schedule for the 29 Knoxville Sessions was already well into the Depression. And then the 30 Knoxville Sessions, recording sessions, 1930 was already when the record industry had tanked, and yet the producer, Richard Voynow was his name. He was a white jazz musician from Chicago who was dedicated to Black music and wanted to do what he could to capture Appalachian Black music. And he sought out Knoxville as the logical place where he could do that. And so that's the real contribution in some respects. I mean, there are others, but the Knoxville Sessions are a wonderful location recording session in addition to the others we've talked about. But they're probably most impactful for having been the place where African-American music in Appalachia was not first documented, because some of that had happened in Bristol and Johnson City, but most lovingly and completely documented. A whole community of African-American artists in East Knoxville was recorded at the Knoxville Sessions and released on records. And so because of that, we can hear their voices, their voices today. We know what they sounded like. Tony and I were able to do some investigative, kind of interviewing and oral history effort to find out from the community members who survived who those people were, because in the case of the Knoxville Sessions, the notes that were taken were not as clear and as thorough. And so we had to do a lot more kind of digging into the archives to figure out who these people were. But we were able, working with the community today, to find out the names and the identities and, the stories of many of those artists. And Knoxville already had a handful of folks already on the search for finding out more about the history of Knoxville. Being a big city, there was already, a historical society, and there was already some research that had been undertaken by people such as Jack Neely and Bradley Reeves and, some others. And we were able to work with them to create the Knoxville Sessions box set, which upon its release in 2016, the city of Knoxville gave it a huge launch event attended by over 10,000 people. So it's a sense, to your listeners about that, these projects may have been worked on in the isolation of one's office, in terms of a research project, but they very much are community projects, and they couldn't exist without the communities taking an interest in them and helping allow the research to be conducted, within the hearts and minds of the people who remembered the stories. So it was, one last thought is, I befriended a whole lot of people in the process of doing the 3 box sets. And of course, the distillation of the 3 box sets can be heard on these single CD releases that are out now on Bear Family with new mastering and new notes. I want to emphasize there are brand new notes on all 3 of the single CD releases. It's not simply a pure distillation. They're actually kind of, I call them revisions, or they're kind of revisiting those sessions with new themes and new emphasis and new masters. So theoretically, one could have the box sets and still learn a great deal by getting the single CD releases. But I befriended a lot of family members of the musicians who recorded 90 plus years ago at these various sessions. And I'm delighted to, say from a personal perspective that many of them are my friends. I talk to them on a semi-regular basis about their great ancestors. These whether or not they were, shall we say, influential artists at the level of Jimmy Rogers or the Carter family. Some of these other artists were influential in terms of their records were influential, influencing people like Doc Watson and Jerry Garcia and Bob Dylan and others. And so just knowing the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of these artists and having an ongoing dialogue about what a gift it was, this music, to the world, I think what it does is it keeps the stories fresh and keeps them reinterpreted in the present day, which I think is essential for historical work. It has to live and breathe in the present day. It has to be well documented and well connected to the real stories of what really happened, but it also has to have a living, breathing presence in the present day. And we also, of course, try to teach this music in East Tennessee State University, where I teach. Many of the students in our bluegrass, old time, and roots music studies program, and other students in the community listen to this music and learn from it and play it, in various kinds of events and among themselves and to the community. So it's very much a living presence today.
And I think that's the joy of these, this project of this collection of box sets, is that I think there can be a danger when something is studied and researched and treated with an academic hat on, that it becomes an artifact that is put in a case and we all look at it and we nod sagely and stroke our chins and go, yes, that's an important thing. But the joy of kind of going through all of this over the past few weeks, as I have, is that it is living, breathing music. And I was reading all the notes and studying it and taking it seriously. But there's points where you just forget all that and you're just listening to a great song. And, it's that the joy of all that work is that it does breathe some more life into something that has plenty of legs left in it. And maybe that's the hope for all this, is that rather than the Bristol Sessions being seen as the Big Bang, it's more like a sort of an open door invitation through which we can then go and explore the rest of it. Because we know the Bristol Sessions, that becomes the touch point and the springboard. But then there's this whole like Narnia of other stuff behind the door that you can go and experience. And there's some wonderful stuff in there.
It's the Bristol Sessions are like a portal to everything that came afterwards. And the way I look at it, everything that came before. And so I feel as if it's very important to see that two-way direction there. I love to look at the roots of the Bristol Sessions. I love to look at the roots of the Johnson City Sessions or the Knoxville Sessions. And one can learn so much about not only music, but culture and human nature and society by studying the music and the lyrics and the melodies and the harmonies and the ways and the attitudes behind the performances, and the sense of humor behind much of it, and the sense of pathos of some of the ballads and the more serious music. One can learn so much about human nature, and it connects one to the past, but it also empowers one in the present. I always feel, much more connected to Appalachia, where I live here in East Tennessee, through this music, even as I feel as if this music is not limited by place. It's music of humanity. Just as I love to listen to international music from other continents, it enriches me as a human being. I feel as if this music has that impact to the people I know in other places. I mean, I have friends over the world who love this music, and Tony Russell, this great old-time music scholar, lives in London, and Bear Family Records is based in Germany. Many of the biggest fans and the most insightful reviews of these sets have come from places like Australia and Sweden and other places, Japan, places around the world. So it's very much the music of humanity. But in the process of doing the deep dive study, I feel much more connected to the place in which I live. So it's an interesting, I don't know what to call it, a yin and yang kind of experience, where it connects one to the roots while also kind of lofts one into a new sense of understanding, to use the tree metaphor, up into a new dimension up there. So it's living, breathing music, and it's hearing the old recordings. They don't seem old to me when I listen to them. I hope they don't to others, but thanks to Bear Family, I think with the great masters, they don't seem detached from us through eroded sound. I mean, the sound, the wearing out of the 78s is not an issue in the Bear Family release philosophy, which because they use state-of-the-art technology to bring it to shape. But they also, and this is important, they also firmly avoid in these new masters the remix kind of call it with all the new Beatles remixes. You know, some people are really reacting against the concept that you could take historical music and just, you know, relayer it and kind of, you know, reshape it in some way. Bear Family definitely doesn't ever want to do that. There's an integrity to their approach that is my personal philosophy, and I feel very happy to work with a company that believes in that. I feel as if, you know, the human mind is always curious to hear what can happen with music when it's remixed, and the technology makes it possible to happen. And I've heard some interesting experiments with field recordings that have been remixed into new form. It's intellectually challenging, and it's maybe it's fun, but it is really important to honor the performance style, the sensibility of the original artist who made those records. Now, if people today want to interpret it differently, and that's all part of the constant change that's part of our cultural world, that's fine. You know, but that's different. The historical records need to be understood in historical context, even as we enjoy them as relevant in the present day. So that's the Bear Family philosophy. I think it's borne out in their more than 300 box sets, and it's certainly a philosophy I'm comfortable with as a historian. So it's walking that walk of honoring tradition and making it discernible and living, breathing in the present day is the challenge of the work that I do, and I think of people I deeply respect in the historical recorded sound research world. It's people such as Tony Russell, and before him Charles Wolfe and others active in this world. Tony and Charles are more or less contemporaries, so just to clarify, but Tony's still doing masterful projects in historical music today, and it's a deep honor to work with him. And as a team, I think we hope to continue to do this sort of work of bringing location recording sessions to the public. And there's plans in the offing to kind of expand our awareness that, sure, the Bristol sessions were amazing, but there are all these other amazing location sessions, and let's get to know them too, because the music from them is equally wonderful. You know, those records in their own way are equally wonderful.
Well, I've really enjoyed going through a bit of that process with these CDs, and you know, I hope people do take some inspiration from this and go and not only hear maybe the Bristol sessions with new ears, but hear these other sessions too. It's, you know, it's been fascinating for me just to spend some time with this music and get to know more about it. And it's been fascinating talking to you about it. Thanks as always, Ted. It's been a real treat.
Matt, it's always a pleasure, and thank you so much for what you do. And it's so important to have these conversations about the music that we all love, and it's an opportunity to have a deep dive into a kind of a complex conversation. So I appreciate your interest, and I've thought of aspects of the story that I've never really discussed before, and that's where, you know, a podcast is a great invention, because it's a deep dialogue about things that matter. So I appreciate all that you do, and thank you for this opportunity.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.